move right into it. End of a long, warm day. Thanks for everybody who is sticking around to the end of the day. I know it's been a long day for you. You've been through a lot of physics, a lot of theory and everything. My purpose today here in front of you is to talk about artifacts. Artifacts are MRI's alter ego. They're the down in the trenches reality of MRI. There's as much work that goes into dealing with artifacts, understanding artifacts, improving artifacts, getting rid of them, that there is to everything else that you heard today about image formation. Everything about image formation was done decades and decades ago. This is the ongoing work and stuff that we deal with on a daily basis. So with any talk, we'll start with the definition. Okay, artifact, from the definition from the dictionary, says something observed in a scientific investigation or experiment that is not naturally present but occurs as a result of the preparative or investigative procedure. And I add a little bit that says, and that every MRI physicist spends more time than anything else attempting to manage, which is the truth. But it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, one person's artifact is another person's contrast. So it all depends on your perspective, all depends on your point of observation and how you deal with it. So there's not going to be a lot of flow to this talk today. It's going to be more of a sampling of how to identify artifacts, because one of the most important things is just identifying artifacts, how to deal with them, and how to optimize them. People come to me every day and they ask to have their protocols optimized, and part of that is dealing with artifacts. You optimize your protocol, you choose parameters, you choose all these things to try to minimize an artifact, but also to optimize the signal to noise in an image, to optimize the contrast, optimize the quality, optimize what you want to observe. Okay? So at the root of every MRI experiment, what we have to understand is what we actually want. And what we want is a really nice image with high contrast, with good signal to noise, that is artifact free. But we really need to understand what the environment looks like. So let's start with a huge magnet, ridiculously huge, okay? Many, many tons. That magnet creates a magnetic field that's about this big. It has to be homogeneous in a region about this big. It's a superconducting magnet filled with lots of wires, surrounded with liquid helium to keep it superconducting. Not only does that magnetic field have to be homogeneous, it has to be stable in time, extremely stable. All these things will lead to improper images. We take that magnet, and what we do is we stick a 1-ton gradient in it. So the first thing is you take this really nice stable system, and you stick something that's totally unstable inside a magnetic field. So inside this gradient weighs about a ton, filled with copper. These copper windings are separated by less than a millimeter in a lot of circumstances. We're passing hundreds of amps of current through it and thousands of volts. And what that does is basically makes a really expensive loudspeaker. Okay? So everybody's been in MRI or been around an MRI. This is the thing that makes all the noise. So you're taking a stable system, you're putting something that switches on the order of kilohertz inside the system and making it vibrate. The next thing you do is let's take a real delicate piece of electronics, like an RF coil. Inside that RF coil, you have hundreds of pieces of circuitry. You have capacitors, and you have inductors, and you have diodes, and you have a lot of wires, and you have circulating currents and everything like that. And you stick it all, and this is the thing that's supposed to be extremely sensitive and pick up all your signal. Stick it inside the gradient, stick it inside the magnet, and you have part of your system. So all these three things, you have a very sort of a delicate balance of hardware. So the next thing you want to do is take a person. You want an image piece of their anatomy. And let's talk about the brain, because that's what we're mostly interested in today. We'll talk about that brain. Well, a person was made fundamentally to move, right? So you take this person, stick them in the magnet, and the first thing you tell them is don't move. And they say, okay, how much can't I move? Well, probably less than a millimeter you can't move. Okay, so how long do I have to do that for? How about an hour? Okay, so they're really still for an hour without moving, otherwise you're going to create crappy images. Well, the person says, okay, fine, we'll pack them in nice and tight, make sure their head doesn't move, okay? Everybody's lying still, they're nice and comfortable. Problem is, people have lungs and they have a heart. And Ravi showed some nice examples in the lungs and heart and everything like that. People breathe and, you know, people say, well, what about breathing? Well, you say, try not to breathe too deep. Try to breathe nice and shallow. So the lungs are moving around, okay? So now you have physiology. Person in the magnet with physiology, they're moving, parts of their body are moving, okay? There's chemistry and physics involved. Then you have people, well, people are like ravens, they like to collect stuff. So before they go inside the magnet, they have pockets, and their pockets are filled with stuff. And no matter what you do, not in all cases you can get stuff out. So they like nice, colorful, shiny things. So they have coins and they have paper clips and stuff. Okay, you can see how this starts to get really complicated quickly. Well, the next thing is you have to screen people, right? And these are the things you can't remove. You have all these medical devices. You might have somebody has a pacemaker, they have implants or something. And these are things that are MR compatible, but we have to deal with them. These are things that also cause artifacts. So we have to consider and we have to choose our parameters based upon the devices that somebody might have in their body. Okay. Now you take this entire environment and you create this box, okay? It's a large Faraday shield. So the whole thing is encompassed in a big copper box, okay? And in that copper box, okay, what we call the Faraday shield, the whole purpose of that Faraday shield is that so we don't have any radio frequency penetrating across that box, okay? Has to be perfectly isolated from the outside world, so FM 96 radio station doesn't go in and create any sort of artifact inside that images. It has to have one grounding point. If you have multiple grounding points, you get grounding loops, creates a whole other series of issues. Along come the clinicians, okay? They say, well, let's control the magnet. So you have a MR technologist choosing parameters. You have a bunch of neuroscientists coming in and say, no, I don't want those parameters, I want these parameters. Okay, so we have to consider that. We have a control, okay? This controls a whole bank of electronics. Of course, there's electronics control the electronics inside the room, okay? We want to make sure that the patient's still alive, so we monitor them, okay? Clinicians say, well, let's do other stuff. Let's have intervention while they're inside the magnet. Let's inject them with gadolinium. Let's have respirators for the ICU patients. Let's do a whole bunch of other things, okay? So we're putting equipment inside the room. So that equipment, of course, is a magnetic field. Can't emit any RF frequency inside the room. And then the neuroscientists come along. They say, well, we really want to communicate with people, okay? We want to present them with stimuli in the back of the magnet, so we have to have these special projectors. Not only do we want to communicate with them that way, we want them to communicate with us, so there's feedback. Okay? And in order to have the feedback, we actually want a record signal too coming back. So we have these devices outside the room. So in order to have any sort of connectivity between what's happening inside the room and outside the room, we need wires. Well, if wires are going inside the room, well, they can act as antennae. An antennae, okay, basically you get an RF signal or frequency that's picked up on a wire here, goes inside the room, it emits noise, it causes problems. So if we want to get rid of that, we have to make sure that everything is filtered, so everything goes through a filter plate properly, you know, when it's grounded and everything's filtered. So there's your picture. Simple, okay? So it's a complex environment. There's lots of stuff going on. Not only any one of these things can fail or create problems in images, but all these things together, they speak to one another, okay? And they can all cause problems for other devices and everything. So anything goes wrong, then you get a crappy image. So, having said all that, okay, what we're going to talk about today. So basically, all MR images have artifacts to some degree. It's just really how we manage them and what our perspective is, how we deal with them. Okay, some can be improved, okay, while others can be totally eliminated. Okay. The most important thing is to be able to identify and understand the source of these artifacts so we can better compensate or remove the ones that we can. So I'll sort of break this down into sort of how I thought a good way to classify artifacts and from their sources or their principles. Okay? There's physiological sources of artifacts, okay? Things that you see in the form of motion and flow. There's the ones that arise from physics, like magnetic susceptibility, okay? And when we talk about susceptibility can be good and bad. There's chemical shift. So Rob talked about, really about chemical shift in a sense when he's talking about spectroscopy. It's all about spectral dispersion and the chemicals that are attached to different proton. And then there's the engineering aspect. There's the acquisition hardware and software. So these are things that we can often eliminate, and it's just with integrity through engineering and improving things like Faraday shields, the equipment that goes inside the room, filtering and other things like that, choice of acquisition parameters, so things that we might see in images like wrapping, spiking, or ringing. Okay, so let's just talk about motion first. The most prominent source of motion is physical motion. Is somebody laying there telling them to lay still and they don't actually lay still. So you get, some is voluntary, some is involuntary. You get respiration and vascular pulsation, and you might get things like swallowing and other things that might cause the brain or the brain stem to move, okay? Swallowing itself may not make the head move, but often makes the lower part of the brain move around a little bit, okay? Motion, okay, has the appearance of an artifact in the image will depend on the direction of motion, okay, whether it's left, right, up, down, forward, backwards, and where in K-space this error occurs. So you've all had your introduction to K-space this morning, so you know how K-space is broken down into lower frequencies and higher frequencies, so depending on where it occurs and the direction it occurs in K-space will have a impact on what that artifact looks like. Artifacts occur from motion, most common in the phase encoding direction, okay, because the phase encoding direction is the slow direction of acquisition. The readout direction is much, much quicker. The middle of K-space in the low frequency area will cause things like smearing and ghosting. And when you move out into the high frequency edges of K-space, you get more things like blurring and ringing, okay? If these phase errors occur and are periodic, as in pulsatile motion, you will get periodic ghosting. So some examples here. Here's a classic example of just a big motion artifact in the phase encode direction. So phase encode directions will be left, right in this image, and you can see these large ghosts and smears at the same time. So this is kind of an extreme example of motion for an image might take a few minutes to acquire. Okay. Then you get more subtle types of motion. So you got an array of this. So if you look in this image, you see this little bit of ringing, okay, on the outside. You get this small degradation in the image. This is a relatively low signal to noise image, but you can see a little bit more here. So the edges are still kind of intact, but you get this smearing of the image. Probably somebody moved more near where the center of K-space was being acquired. Okay. This one you can see that the smearing has kind of come outside, so the whole brain is moving around. Again, another low frequency example. And then somebody that's just totally destroyed, where there's lots of motion through the entire duration of that scan. Okay, an example of a pulsatile flow. So here's in the body. The same thing occurs. You might see this in some brain images from the sagittal sinus when you have a pulsatile flow in some images. Some anatomical images from the sagittal sinus, or the primary piece of anatomy is the aorta here, but because the aorta has this pulsatile motion, okay, you're getting this periodic repetition in K-space that's causing this repetition in the ghost artifact in the anatomical image. Okay, there's tons of ways to alleviate these things, and I'll kind of allude to this in this talk. Any one of these artifacts, you could do an entire talk on it. The literature goes back decades on how to deal with these kind of things, and everybody has their own methods. So I'll just kind of scan over some of the ways that you can try to alleviate some of these artifacts. Okay, so first is obviously, try to say, stop moving, but how do you do that totally? Is sacrificing the subject. What we try to do, and a lot of emphasis in MR nowadays, and it has been for the better part of the last 2 decades, is to go faster. Single shot techniques like EPI, using partial K-space, things like turbo spin echo, so you're doing multiple refocusing pulses for every excitation, and parallel imaging. I think Corey went into parallel imaging earlier on. You can use techniques that are non-Cartesian, like spirals and radials. Because they're non-Cartesian, they don't necessarily have a defined phase encoding direction, so you don't get these coherent ghosts in a particular image. When you use things like spirals or radials, they're circular. So what happens is the energy from an artifact may get smeared or distributed over an image, and it doesn't look so bad. So basically you're just managing it at that point. You can cardiac and respiratory gate if that works for you. What you can do is you can gate, and that becomes part of your TR cycle. So every time somebody breathes during a certain cycle of that respiratory cycle, you gate and you start your acquisition always on the same part of that cycle. You can use navigator echoes. I'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more. Navigator echoes are very useful, and they're useful the type of work that we do in EPI. And you can do, there's a lot of perspective techniques for motion correction. So you can do things like real-time monitoring of the signal. You can use that in post-processing for computation and correction. Okay, so here's an extreme example from before. Like what I was showing you before is an anatomical image that might take multiple minutes. So any motion over those multiple minutes is you get a smearing and you get an artifact. So this is a very extreme example, but the reason I chose an extreme example is because if you go faster, you can actually see that you're not degrading that much the primary image that you're seeing. Okay, the image actually on a whole is not that bad. It's moving around a lot, and I mean this is happening over probably a 2-minute period or something like this. This is sped up, but if it in reality, you could almost take this image and you could almost re-register it back to its basis set and do a motion correction on it. So by going faster, okay, if we could do all imaging like this, even anatomical imaging, all we would get would be a shift in what the image is looking like. We're probably getting some distortions and other things like that, but overall the integrity of the image is good. So this is a good example of just sort of a temporal, what temporally motion might look like inside the magnet. It's also interesting to see that not all the images are moving at the same rate. So you'll see that there's a shift between these two images depending on how they're being excited during the period during the TR period. Okay, so this is another movie. So it's not so apparent probably if you're back at the back of the room. It just seems like a static image that you're looking at. But there's a movie playing. So Ravi showed an example of a magnitude image playing a movie, and he showed a nice respiratory signal sort of going back and forth. So this one is a little more subtle. So if you look at where the arrows are, you have vascular pulsation. Okay, you might have some CSF pulsation. Okay, which is usually a byproduct of vascular pulsation. So as the vasculature is kind of pulsing, it's moving the CSF around stuff. So this is something that might create noise. It might create some sort of problem when you're doing your analysis. Okay, so navigation. So navigation is sort of an important thing that we look at and that we measure almost in all our EPI. So when anybody's doing a functional experiment, we use navigator. So the most basic navigator requires a non-encoded one-dimensional measure of phase, okay, typically for every slice in TR period. Okay, the phase measured from the navigator reduces the line-to-line variations in K-space. So we take a snapshot, we measure the phase, we go back in post-processing or in real time as we're creating these images, okay, as we're reconstructing the images, use the phase and try to reduce that phase-to-phase line variation. The measurement of navigator is applied during image reconstruction, as I said, okay? And this is what it might look like. So this is a spin echo EPI experiment, okay, with diffusion weighting. So diffusion is very sensitive to these kind of things. You put your navigators, okay? Navigator is a non-encoded thing, so you slip it in, doesn't take that much time. We measure the phase from these things, and then in reconstruction, we can correct any sort of changes in phase from line to line in EPI. And here's a great example of this is 2 anatomical images. So these ones take probably about 8 minutes to acquire, okay? In this case, person wasn't physically moving. All they were doing was basically breathing, okay? So there's no physical motion, there's just field changes from this person breathing. And you can see outside the image, you have this energy of the smear of the motion artifact. You can particularly see it in areas that are just proximal to the frontal sinus, okay? And what happens if we apply the Navigator Echo, that measurement of phase, to the reconstruction, this cleans it right up. You see all the removal of the energy outside, so the line-to-line variation in the phase has disappeared. You've stopped all these ringing in the front, and basically overall the crispness of the image has improved. Okay, so just for this part, motion is ever present and will always compromise the data, the MRI quality. Phase discontinuities are the main cause of motion artifacts. Okay, it causes blurring, smearing, ghosting in the image. Okay, several methods to alleviate going faster navigation and post-processing, for example. Okay, let's talk a little bit about physics, because physics is really at the root of where a lot of the artifacts come from, and this is where this becomes a perspective thing. From a physical standpoint, it could be internal, external medium that interacts with the physical space. Okay, it can have an influence from the atomic level to a macroscopic level. It can be endogenous or exogenous in nature. And this is sort of my first example, because a lot of people ask me this the first time they sit down at the scanner. They always go, for a 3-plane localizer, okay, and they always say, what are the black lines? Does anybody know what the black lines are without reading this? Yeah, Olivia does, of course she does. Okay, black lines is just a nice example of a spin history effect. So a 3-plane localizer is basically when you go in, you're trying to localize where the person is inside the magnet, take a quick sagittal, quick coronal, or quick axial image in succession, okay, and depending which one got collected first, okay, it won't have any sort of spin history effect on it, but the next time you take an image, so if the sagittal got acquired first, and then you acquire a coronal, it's going to leave a black line there because where that sagittal image has created this spin history. Okay, that's all these lines. It's not really, it's not a great example because these are not the final images, these are just localizers, but it's always something that somebody asks. So it's a good example of spin history. However, there are certain things that you do in the clinic that causes you to do things in different orientations. So mostly what we do is we acquire things maybe in an axial orientation. We do a stack of images for fMRI. So you never have any sort of overlap between slices. But there's a lot of examples in the clinic where you might do something in the spine where you fan out your image orientation, okay, and then a lot of those images will overlap in a certain area and you'll get the same sort of effect as you see here. So if you ever see dark bands that look really, unnatural or something like that, it's probably from a spin history. Magnetic susceptibility, the basis of everything that we do in fMRI. So Ravi talked about this at length this afternoon, okay? The presence of material with susceptibility different than the surrounding tissue distorts the main magnetic field. And it's just a scaling of that distortion that we talk about when we talk about susceptibility. It causes inaccurate spatial encoding, okay, from spatial gradients that lead to distortion, signal loss, or dropout of anatomical structures. The magnitude of the effect is parameter and sequence dependent. So depending on how we choose, okay, something that has susceptibility within our object, okay, is dependent on the echo time, things like the bandwidth, the voxel size, whether we use gradient echo or spin echo. And of course it's field strength dependent too. Okay, magnetic susceptibility, friend or foe. Well, this is an artifact talk, so we know where it's a friend, but it's really, like I said, this is depends on your perspective. So magnetic susceptibility, there's a large spectrum, and there's a large spectrum when we're talking in terms of MR. So probably a friend, right? So in this case, we want to make a bold image. So really, we're just imaging artifact. Okay, in reality, it's artifact, but it's a good artifact. It's an artifact at the microscopic level. So we're looking at the capillaries, we're looking at the venules, and we're looking at the susceptibility differences between that deoxygenated blood state, okay, and the tissue surrounding it. So we're actually creating a small little artifact that's distorting the magnetic field, that's allowing us to see changes temporally in time. So this is a friend. Again, probably a friend, okay? What we're doing in this case is we're looking not at the microvasculature or the venules, we're looking at more of the veins, okay? We're trying to make a venous map, okay, as in the case of susceptibility weighted imaging, or for QSM, looking at structures that are rich in iron, okay, both susceptibility agents to create contrast, okay, so this is a good example of a contrast artifact used to create some other sort of, to pick out some other structure inside an image. Then you kind of cross the line and you say, okay, here's an image that has a combination of both, okay? So you're looking at your venules, so you have good contrast, and then you have bad contrast. You're actually missing a part of the brain from the air tissue interface. So you have a combination of two things. So bad, so friend and foe. And then lastly, you have somebody that probably shouldn't have gone in the magnet, that probably should have had normal X-ray, and you can go on the internet and you can see a million examples of this kind of thing. This could be caused by a small sliver in somebody's orbital, in the orbital socket, or right inside of the eye, that creates a large susceptibility artifact from a ferrous object. Definitely a foe. But if you're looking for this kind of stuff, maybe a friend. Okay, so all these things create different magnitudes of B0 variation. Okay, like I said at the beginning, here we take this huge structure, this magnet, ridiculously strong magnetic field, okay, and everything we do is trying to make that magnetic field homogeneous. But everything we really do makes that thing inhomogeneous. We stick a person inside that magnet, makes it inhomogeneous. So here's slices near the top of the brain, okay, this is a field map, okay, this is a B0 variation. Actually looks pretty homogeneous, okay, across it. As you move down and you go further down in the brain, okay, still pretty homogeneous, but the closer you get to the air cavities, okay, in the front of the head, you get these large shifts in the magnetic field, okay, and you're probably shifting on the order of 100 to 150 hertz here. And the further and further down you go, okay, it gets worse and worse, and now you can see it in the temporal lobes, around the temporal bones, okay, further down in the sinus, and that's what the field map looks like. And all these things, we have to try to deal with it. So we're always trying to shim and trying to optimize and trying to minimize the effect from these field offsets that we're actually creating by putting somebody inside. So Ravi showed a magnitude example. This is essentially like a field map. Okay, this is the phase image of an EPI. Okay, multiple EPI images. Ravi showed a magnitude image of somebody breathing and showed the magnitude going. It's actually much more sensitive to look at the phase or look at a temporal field map here. So it might be hard to discern, but I mean the brain is kind of surrounded here. You're getting these phase effects, okay, in the phase image in the unshimmed areas, okay, where you got multiple bands and multiple wraps. But the important thing to note is you kind of look at the fringe lines, okay. So this again is sped up. But these fringe lines are changing and the brain is changing. Actually, there's no motion, there's no physical motion here. This is all due to just somebody breathing. The lungs filling up, okay, are changing the magnetic field lower down in the brain. The actual sinus cavity is filling up with oxygen, which is a susceptibility medium compared to the tissue around it, and it's causing more variation. So it's just something that creates noise in your fMRI image. Okay, again, from a static perspective, what's it look like? Here's the field map. You get a large field offset, creates some sort of distortion. How do we deal with these distortions? We obviously, if it's important for you to image in this region of the brain, we want to get that signal back. Okay, so distortion correction for EPI. What can we do? We can accelerate. I think Corey would have gone over some of this, GRAPPA and SENSE. This is done in real time. There's a relatively small penalty in the image quality by doing so. We can go to SpinEcho EPI, try to refocus any of those static inhomogeneities that we're seeing, not the dynamic ones, the static ones like the sinuses. Okay, GRACE, which is a combination of gradient and SpinEcho. They're a little bit slower, they're power intensive, and they have less bold sensitivity overall. Libby will tell you all about that. We can take things like the B0 field map, okay? So we acquire a field map in post-processing, we can quantify that field map and we can try to recover some of the signal from those distortions. There's other alternate techniques like measuring of the point spread function of the distortion. This is essentially in real-time construction, but we need a reference image to do that, so all these things come with some sort of overhead. There's a dual acquisition with reverse phase encoding, and this is a popular way that we do this, but it requires an extra acquisition. Okay, and then there's things called Z shimming. That's basically taking a stack of slices with different refocusing gradients on the slice encode. But again, there's something that takes more and more time. These are just things that you might see in the literature when you're seeing. It's just takes extra time. So, I mean, the one thing that we use on a daily basis is just parallel imaging. Like I said, Corey went over that. When you get distortions in the frontal lobes, you'll see that if you accelerate by a factor of 2, you start to recover some of the signal, but as you acquire less and less lines, okay, if you have a good coil and lots of signal to noise, that you can recover a lot of that the signal back where it's distorted. Okay, eddy currents. So eddy currents can be induced on any conducting surface within the MR environment. Okay, that includes all the stuff that we stick inside. Gradient coils, okay, in the main magnet, okay, the tube of the main magnet is a conducting surface. The cryo shields inside the main magnet is a conducting surface. The liquid helium vessel, the RF shields, all these things are surfaces that we can actually create eddy currents on. Okay, and eddy currents create two undesired phenomena. Okay, they create unwanted time varying gradients. Okay, so we create primary gradients with the gradient coil. This creates unwanted gradients from the eddy currents. Okay, eddy currents also cause shifts in the main magnetic field, so we don't want shifts. We want everything to be stable, we want it to be homogeneous, and we don't want any residual signal coming from any other place inside that system. The nice thing about a lot of this is they're all static. We can characterize them, and we can create pre-emphasis. So we're taking a gradient waveform. We can pre-emphasize it for what the sort of the behavior of these systems are, but it's when we put things inside the magnet that we're not expecting that will create eddy currents that we can't really compensate for. Okay, so as per Faraday's law, the magnitude of an eddy current depends on the rate of change of the inciting magnetic field. Okay, so this is particularly important in sequence with rapidly switching or large gradient fields. Okay, they produce the most severe eddy current problems like EPI and diffusion. Diffusion is particularly bad because they have huge gradients. Okay, EPI-based sequences are especially vulnerable where a characteristic eddy current artifact. Okay, this is Nyquist. When you, I think Corey talked about Nyquist. These ghosts are common. So here's an example. Okay, in a perfect K-space, okay, all your phase encode lines, all the phase lines up perfectly. But if you have an eddy current that creates a systematic change in the phase from a positive going gradient to a negative going gradient, okay, so you get a different eddy current there. Okay, you get a misalignment of phase in a producible way that you get a Nyquist ghost that creates this ghosting on the outside. So these are the kind of things that you don't want. So what we have to try to do in time is by aligning these phases, we can realign them so everything lines up so it creates one coherent image like this one. Okay, eddy currents can also do other nasty things like shifting images, okay, shifting images in space. They can contract, okay, or expand images. They can also shear images, depending on where the susceptibility lies. A lot of times if you phase encode in the left-right direction, the whole image will smear like this. It will turn into a banana because you have a lot more susceptibility at the front of the brain than you do at the back of the brain. So all these things need to be corrected, and a lot of times we do this in post-processing for things like diffusion. Chemical shift. Chemical shift is kind of like what Rob talked about a little bit in MRS. Protons and fat and water, just like protons between water and metabolites, okay, they process at different frequencies, okay, at different magnetic field strengths. Okay, the resonant frequency difference between fat and water is 3.5 parts per million. It increases with field, okay, not the 3.5 parts per million, but in absolute hertz. So at 3T, you have about 430 hertz shift between fat and water, where at 7T, you have about 1,300 hertz shift in fat and water. Okay, the difference in the resonant frequency between fat and water leads to spatial misregistration of the MR signal. Okay, so obviously when you have fat in a particular structure and it resonates at a different frequency, it will shift in space, so you get that misregistration. So you see this funny ghost in an image. The result is a spatial position along the frequency coding axis. So the nice thing about this is because it's very predictable, we can manipulate parameters, or we can predict where a fat water shift may go, and we can move it to where we want. So if we take an example for a 25 centimeter field of view, 256 by 256 matrix, okay, you have a gradient strength, for example, that is 10 millitesla per meter, and with the 250, that's your size of your field of view, 250 millimeters, okay, that creates a gradient dispersion across the image of 0.0025 Tesla. Okay, at 0.0025 Tesla, you have 42.57, this is the Larmor frequency, 42.57 megahertz per Tesla. That means 106 kilohertz over the field of view. Okay, 106 kilohertz over the field of view over 256 pixels, you basically get 415 hertz per pixel. Okay, so if you have a shift, a fat water shift of a certain amount, if it's a 600 hertz shift between fat and water, okay, that's going to be about a pixel and a half or something like that. But oftentimes you get some things that are much bigger. So to be able to reduce it, or if you want to reduce this, you can increase the receiver bandwidth, decrease the voxel size. Basically what you want to do is increase the gradient strength. Okay, and this is an example of that misregistration. So you see the scalp, okay, the skin tissue signal here in the brain image. No fat in the brain, just fat in the scalp. But the signals from the fat are processing a little bit differently, and you're getting a large shift in the fat signal, which is interfering with your signal inside your brain. These things are relatively easy to deal with. We can suppress fat. So here's a very simple spectrum, okay, like maybe Rob would have shown, where you have water, you have lipids. Dispersion between the two is 3.5 parts per million. It's pretty common to do things like water excitation, okay, or fat suppression. Okay, fat suppression is a very good technique. Just like Rob did water suppression to get rid of this, so he could see the metabolites down here. We're doing lipid suppression to get rid of this signal, so all we're seeing is water inside the images. Okay, this image has got a couple bonus things. You have a large susceptibility, so you're seeing that in the knee. This is a fat suppressed image, getting rid of the cancellous bone fat from here. So what happens is a lot of these images, if you don't fat suppress, this whole signal sort of goes up into the area of interest that we're trying to look at. In this case, what would be the cartilage. It overlaps and interferes with our primary point of interest. Okay, so summary for that section. Artifacts can be created from internal external media. They can have influence at the atomic level to a macroscopic level. Okay, susceptibility, eddy currents, chemical shift, and other common sources of physical artifact. Okay, the last little bit I'm going to go through, these are kind of things that we can deal with and not necessarily something that we use for contrast, or we could use for contrast. Aliasing, okay, Corey talked a little bit about this, I saw. When you have a spatial resolution that's determined by choosing the field of view and the imaging matrix. Okay, the field of view is chosen considering the structure of interest, say the brain or the head, and a desired spatial resolution. A field of view that is smaller than the structure of interest leads to a wraparound or aliasing of artifacts in the phase encode directions. Okay, so this one has the bonus of 2. So this is a 3D volume. 3D volume has 2 phase encoding directions. Okay, it has the primary phase encoding and has a phase encoding sort of what we can call in the slice direction. So this, you can see the nose poking around. We didn't use a field of view that was large enough. And it's just starting to poke into our region of interest here. Left, right, we didn't choose a field of view here. So that's what it looks like. Easy to alleviate, okay? Increase the field of view, which may decrease the resolution. We can oversample the data, okay? That increases the number of steps in the phase encoded direction, which may increase your imaging time. and it may cause an SNR penalty too. We can choose a phase and frequency direction, so the phase is in the narrower direction, oftentimes left, right in the brain. Okay, we can use a surface coil, because if you have a surface coil beside an object, the distance from the object, the signal disappears on the other side. So you can imagine if you put it on one side of the brain, there's no signal over here. So if there's no signal to overlap. So you don't have to do things like reduce the field of view. Okay, you can also apply saturation pulses to try to get rid of signal in those overlapping areas. Okay, partial volume effect. This occurs if the slice thickness or the volume of a voxel is larger than the pieces of anatomy of interest inside of that voxel or slice. It's when you see multiple tissue types or it comes within a single voxel. So if you take a single voxel, Ravi showed a great example where you had a 3x3x3 voxel, and he showed all the vascularity inside of that. You have everything from macrovessels to microvessels and everything in between. The signal from that single voxel is a culmination of everything that's coming from that entire voxel. So by making things smaller, okay, you're going to try to compartmentalize where the signal is coming from. Okay, so basically said that. So this is what it looks like in a nutshell. This is a slice select kind of example. If you have a thick slice and you have a bunch of objects within that slice, what you're doing is if you took a projection of this or you looked at what the resultant image would look like, you're going to get a culmination of this signal and this signal to see these structures. If you took a thinner slice, you take these thinner balls in the middle, you're going to be able to resolve the structure of these two thinner balls, okay, over here and this ball here, as compared to everything being sort of blurred out in the thick slice example. So thicker slices reduces the contrast of smaller structures. Okay, partial volume artifact is most likely to occur in the slice direction of the image, but not necessarily. Just tends to be the one that's the thickest. So here's a good example of something with a 3mm slice and a 10mm slice, and what you see is just a blurring out of the image. Signal truncation tends to occur near boundaries of high and low signal intensity. Okay, so very, very sharp boundaries. Air and brain, or air and skull, CSF and brain tissue. This appears as periodic ringing at high contrast interfaces, often referred to as Gibbs ringing, if you've ever seen this the term before. It can mimic motion a little bit because it looks like somebody has moved a little bit, but actually it's just from an acquisition problem. It's caused by approximation errors in the Fourier transform analysis. So I'm not going to go deep into this, but say you had an object of interest that has a lot of sharp interfaces, okay, a lot of high contrast boundaries. You take this object, okay, this is the Fourier transform of that object. We know in K-space, okay, if we sample, and this is the highest particular frequency of sampling in K-space, okay, this is what the Fourier transform looks like. You can see it will start to replicate what that object will look like. Okay, if this is the highest frequency, we can't image. So we have frequencies up to this frequency. When we take all those frequencies and we add them together, we can get sort of a representation of that. The higher the frequency we go, the better we start to get. But we can see this ringing effect. Okay, that is the Gibbs ringing. Okay, and the higher and higher. So you still have a little bit of ringing there. But we're getting, our frequency is moving out here, the frequency is getting much higher, so we're getting much more frequencies to sample what the object actually looks like. But it's never perfect. And this is kind of what it looks like in the end. So you get this Gibbs ringing. So a relatively low resolution image is going to create a lot more of this ringing. So the way to fix that is to image it at a higher resolution. Image non-uniformities. These are unexpected signal intensity variations across an imaging plane or a volume. Okay, they can be due to RF transmission, like a surface coil transmit. There are wave effects at high field, the way coils are loaded. Receive coil sensitivity can create non-uniformities. Loading failure in the receive chain, the coil, the preamp, or the receiver. Field variations like B0, so the examples I showed before. So here's one from a receiver chain. So this is one, say, a 32 channel head coil that a lot of people use. You get a relatively homogeneous image here. If one receiver shuts off, you really can't tell much of the difference. You're getting a small variation, so 1 out of 32 receivers doesn't create too much of a problem inside of an image, other than probably reducing the SNR ever so slightly. This is why it's important to do a lot of QA, so quality assurance on sort of on a weekly basis to make sure that your coils are working, all the receivers are working, the receiver chain is working properly. So you eliminate things like this. You could probably get away with a number of coils actually not working before you'd see a noticeable difference, any sort of quantifiable difference in the image. Well, not a quantifiable, but a qualitative difference in this image. But if you take half the receivers, then you start to see a big chunk of the shading coming around here. So now you know you have a real problem. Inhomogeneous RF transmit. Okay, so this is something typical at high field. If you have a circularly polarized transmit coil, you'll get large brightening, a wave effect in the middle of the image, and you have, so this is representative of what the transmit field would look like. High flip angles in the middle, lower flip angles on the outside. Okay, but we can use things like parallel transmit to do B1 shimming, just like we do B0 shimming. We manipulate the magnetic field from multiple transmit coils to try to flatten out that transmit field. Okay, receive coil sensitivity at 3T. This is what a receive coil would actually look like. Okay, close to the receive coil, you get very high signal to noise ratio. Okay, and much lower signal to noise ratio. So this is what the image really looks like. This is what we're doing by artificially correcting it. We look at the receiver sensitivities and we artificially bring up the signal intensity from the outside through the reconstruction process, whether that be through sum of squares or something like that, using the receiver coil sensitivities to make it a much more flatter and a much more palatable image to look at. But the actual signal to noise is no different in this image than in this image. It just looks better in the middle of the brain here. And these kind of things are corrected sort of through something that we call pre-scan normalization. This happens sort of on the 3T scanner all the time. Okay, so RF interference, almost done here, so thanks for sticking with it. So RF interference, zipper artifacts, are RF noise from external sources entering the MRI room. Okay, this is one source. It's either from a compromised RF shield, so that big copper box that we talked about earlier. Maybe somebody hasn't closed the door during your image acquisition. Equipment inside the room can also do the same thing. It can emit radio frequencies. So these are improperly filtered wires or anything like that inside the room. So this is kind of what it looks like here. Okay, you get these characteristic zipper lines or very straight lines kind of coming through. So if you ever see an image like this, the image signal to noise kind of tends to drop, and you get these very prominent bands going through. The same thing for a piece of equipment inside the room, like I said, can emit that sort of frequency, and you get the same kind of thing as you get these sort of lines. It can be one line, it can be multiple lines. Spiking of white pixels, usually a component, so what you see is a bright or white data point or points inside a K-space. Okay, it's usually where you see it. Okay, they create periodic and parallel lines in image space. Most often they're due to electronic component breakdown, like a gradient coil or an RF coil. Okay, can also be created from static discharges. Okay, that's what we keep. Humidity is very constant in the magnet room and around electronics. Conductive surfaces, also when they periodically touch, if you have a loose bolt or something like that that vibrates, can create these kind of spikes. So here's your K-space, here's an EPI image, here's kind of a line of K-space that got corrupted from something breaking down, whether it's a electronic breakdown or whatever. It's the same image acquired without the breakdown being fixed. You get a better EPI K-space, no artifact in the EPI. Receiver overflow, okay, is where we just sort of exceed the digitization range of the analog to digital converter. Okay, by setting the gain on the system appropriately, we can get rid of this kind of thing, and this is what it looks like. So high signal intensity tends to wrap wrap the analog to digital converter around, you get low signal intensity where you should have got high signal intensity. So it's very characteristic, very fixable. Okay, and lastly, gradient distortions. So everybody thinks you go inside a magnetic field, the gradients are perfect. Gradients are not perfect. So over a 244 millimeter field of view, okay, there's a lot of distortion over the gradients. So the gradient should be perfectly straight. This is a grid phantom that should be perfectly straight. You can see where the gradient starts to break down right at the very end, but it also has this characteristic barrel look to it. Okay, so this is a good example of an image right at the very end where the gradient field tends to collapse upon itself. This is not what a person looks like. We didn't chop off a head and image. Okay, the person's neck would come down and it wouldn't compress like that. Oops. So if we superimpose the two, okay, you can see where the gradient field starts to distort and compress upon itself is about the end of our imaging region as in this example. So I only bring this up because it's really important. If you're doing quantitative segmentation of gray matter and white matter in a particular image, it's important that you do things like fix the gradients, okay? Do a post-processing step where you actually do a corrected gradient field, okay? Because inside the brain, it doesn't look like there's a distortion inside that, but you're actually getting displacement of pixels. Things are looking like the volume is getting smaller or getting larger in particular areas. So if you're quantifying the gray matter and the white matter, then you probably have an incorrect value if you're doing quantitation. Okay, so in conclusion, artifacts exist, all images to some degree. Okay, in the literature there are about as many papers dealing with artifact reduction as there are for image formation. Okay, some can be eliminated or reduced, some cannot. Okay, the ability to identify artifacts is an important step in addressing them. And so what could possibly go wrong? So in a case like this, who knows? There's lots of stuff going on. So there's lots, but at the end of the day, MR mostly works. Thanks. The tour de force, that's lots. I mean, a lot of artifacts.
I guess just one question. Where do you draw the line between what end user needs to know about and be able to correct versus what sort of needs to be corrected by the MRI physicist?
Like I said, it's an ongoing job at our end. So we're always dealing with the hardware and the software end. And I mean, having some basic knowledge of what artifacts look like and where they may be coming from is an important step to somebody taking their data away, because while we really are doing quality assurance on a daily basis, we can't do a quality assurance on a study basis. So if somebody takes their data away and they go away, they say, hey, I saw this stuff inside the image, I'm not sure what it was like or what it was caused from. You know, you might have some insight or something like that. It looks like a zipper artifact or something. And we say, well, did you have your equipment? Did you plug it into the filter? Did you do things like that? Or it might be some problem with our piece of equipment. So, I mean, there's lots of resources on the internet. There's lots of resources for looking at and identifying artifacts. So I think it's good for everybody to sort of understand where artifacts come from or what they may look like outside of the normal scope of what might happen to somebody moving inside the magnet.
And I guess you didn't show a lot of sort of artifacts you would see from sort of 4D images. I guess, well, there was the motion stuff, but
like drifting and
yeah, or I mean things that you would normally look for sort of at the end of sort of a bold study rather than just a structural scan. But anyways, what I was going to allude to is just the fact that there are tools out there that can help with automated identification of things or to help visualize certain artifacts. So and some of those are going to be